Immediately staking a claim in the center, white prepares for a central battle and future development. Developing the knight to f6 immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for a flexible pawn structure. Asserting central dominion, this pawn push immediately stakes a claim and prepares to contest space. Preparing to fianchetto, the bishop unlocks the long diagonal, aiming to pressure white's center. Securing the center's pawn structure and preparing a kingside castling, white solidifies their foothold while inviting black's fianchettoed bishop to a potential confrontation. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal now establishes control over the long-range dark squares, a key element in this setup. Developing the knight solidifies central control and prepares kingside castling, a standard yet effective maneuver. Establishing central pawn presence and preparing for kingside fianchetto development solidifies black's solid structure. Building a fianchettoed bishop for kingside pressure, preparing to castle safely. Solidifying the kingside and preparing for kingside castling, this knight gracefully occupies a developing square that supports future central expansion. Developing the bishop to a square where it stares down black's queenside, potentially limiting counterplay while reinforcing the central pawn chain. Securing the monarch instantly enhances piece safety and prepares for central expansion. Solidifying the castled position mirrors black's king safety, establishing a strong foundation for future maneuvers. Challenging the center immediately, black boldly seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for active piece play. Asserting central space firmly with a pawn thrust, white immediately challenges black's ambitious pawn push and prepares to potentially liberate their queenside. Preparing to contest the central files and perhaps reinforce the kingside with a timely h6 push. Developing the bishop solidifies control of the central dark squares and prepares to challenge black's kingside pawn structure. Releasing the central tension opens up lines for piece activity, demanding careful attention to pawn structure and potential outpost development. Reclaiming the center with this knight immediately reignites the pawn tension and opens lines for your pieces. Rerouting the knight to this central square initiates a dynamic contest for control of key diagonals and prepares for potential pawn pushes, creating significant imbalances. Developing the queen's bishop to its ideal diagonal, this maneuver aims to bolster the queenside pawn structure and potentially prepare for a future queenside expansion. The knight surges forward, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially eye the weak f2 square. Unlocking the c3 knight's potential by vacating the d4 square, aiming for a queenside expansion. Repositioning the knight to the active c6 square is a sound idea, aiming to challenge the central tension and develop further. Preparing to reroute the knight towards a more active square, aiming to dismantle black's centralized pieces and gain breathing room. Unleashing a pawn storm now risks exposing your king, a daring gambit to disrupt white's central grip. Challenging black's knight on g4 directly, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt coordination and open lines for potential counterplay. Stepping back, the knight creates a defensive shield, anticipating potential pawn storms. This pawn sacrifice shatters black's pawn structure, aiming to exploit the weakened central squares and open lines towards the king. Recapturing the pawn with the bishop liberates the knight and strengthens the pawn chain, setting the stage for future attacking possibilities. Shifting the queen away from the pawn chain creates opportunities to exploit the d-file and prepares for a potential queenside pawn advance. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, h5 immediately challenges white's pawn structure and creates space for black's pieces to maneuver. Pivoting the rook to the king's file immediately intensifies pressure on black's castled position. Seeking to connect the rooks and prepare for a central pawn push, the queen takes up a central post. Securing the monarch from potential kingside threats, this repositioning subtly aims to support a future advance while maintaining flexibility. Prioritizing king's safety, black tucks away their monarch, a prudent measure given the open center. Sharpening the attack, This bishop repositioning eyes potential breakthroughs on the kingside, potentially creating new attacking avenues. Pushing the knight forward boldly probes the kingside structure, daring white to exploit the exposed g-pawn or risk a positional imbalance. Initiating a knight repositioning, aiming to reinforce the central pressure and potentially exploit the weakened kingside squares. Securing the c-pawn provides a vital structural backbone, preparing for potential pawn pushes and discouraging white's knight from easily infiltrating. Sacrificing the bishop on f6 forces open the g-file, potentially exposing the black king for an attack and disrupting the pawn structure. Reclaiming the bishop solidifies your queenside pawn structure and prepares a counterthrust down the f-file, leveraging the open diagonal. Introducing active pieces to the queenside, aiming to exploit the open e-file and pressure black's underdeveloped queenside. Strategically repositioning the bishop to a more active square, eyeing white's central control and potential weaknesses. Recentering the queen creates pressure on the queenside and prepares for a potential queenside advance. This move reroutes the queen, seeking to pressure the central pawns and potentially prepare a queenside expansion. Repositioning the knight to control the e4 square and prepare for a kingside attack. Reclaiming the d-file with the rook solidifies central influence and prepares for potential pawn advances. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, this aggressive push seeks to destabilize black's defenses and open lines towards the vulnerable king. Pivoting the knight to f7 anticipates a potential exchange on e5, reinforcing the kingside and preparing for future maneuvering. Recapturing that pawn reshapes the central pawn structure, opening lines and preparing for a potential kingside assault. This pawn push aims to contest the central squares, though it does invite doubled pawns if the knight is challenged directly. Opening a dynamic line for the knight, this aggressive foray disrupts black's defensive structure.